themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And Jesus, he's expressing to us, he's saying, and you know, I think we read these verses now, 2,000 years later, and it doesn't hold the emotional weight that I think that it did when Jesus first said it and when he was expressing it to his disciples. Right now it's this romantic, it's this, you know, you hear triumphant music when you hear these verses being read, or it's like very, you know, pumped up where God is saying, like, if you want to be my disciple, give up everything. But I think we fail to see the kind of, the emotion that was behind when Jesus is first saying this. Do you imagine, like, he's just talking about this, he's talking about how he is going to suffer. He's going to be nailed onto the cross, and he's saying to them, if you want to be my disciple, that's what you're going to go through. That's what you have to go through. You have to take up your cross. You got to follow me. If you think that Jesus is saying, oh yeah, that's what you got to do, this is how it's happening, and he's happy and he's pumped up, I think we're missing the point, because the human side of Jesus is coming out. The humanity, the full humanity of Jesus is saying, oh, guys, when I tell you that the cost of discipleship means laying down everything that you have, to die to yourself, to take up your cross, to follow me, I'm not just telling you because I have to or because I'm God and it's easy for me to say. It's difficult for me. And I'm going to demonstrate it for you by the way that I take the cross. You see, when Jesus teaches his disciples and when he's asking us to be his followers, his sons and daughters, and when he says it's going to be hard, that we're going to have to make sacrifices, it's not with a light heart. He doesn't just teach it and he's like, okay, you guys figure it out, I don't care what you go through, and he goes away. But he's invested. He's saying, look, I'm going to put my life in the line. It's going to hurt me as much as it's going to hurt you. And it's going to hurt me even more than you can ever imagine, because I'm going to take the cross once and for all of you. And so I think many of us, okay, and myself included, when we hear these verses and we're like, oh, it's so difficult, right? I have so many different verses when I read it, I'm like, this is just so hard, it's almost unrealistic, and I kind of find myself justifying in my mind, well, you know, it's okay because I'm just human. It's okay because I'm just human and I have all these mistakes, I have all these flaws, it's all right for me to have these things. I beg of you to remember that Jesus was human as well. He experienced all the temptations, all the struggles, all the pain, all the difficulties of having to be obedient to God, and yet he shows us an example. He says, yes, do it. And what's amazing about that is that we have a God that not only commands, but also understands what it feels to be in obedience to his will. Do you see how that's different? We have a God that not only just tells us what it means to do the things that we're supposed to do, not only commands, but he also understands the very core, the difficulty, the sacrifice that will be involved. And he doesn't do it with a light heart. And so this morning, as we think about this, and as we think about it, and we're going to look at it as Jesus goes to the cross, okay, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to take a look at what this is, and what exactly is Jesus calling us, and we're going to try to flesh it out more and more each week, but we're going to start it off small, okay, and I'm going to try to think of some things that we can possibly do to kind of bring this home for us, to kind of get the process started. And so two things that I want to talk about. The first thing is, as we think about the cost of discipleship, as we think about the emotion and the pain and the empathy that Christ displays when he says, if you want to be my disciple, you have to follow me. The first thing is that we have to start one step at a time. Okay? Start one step at a time. See a clue about in our school today. Okay? And it's an interesting one, because what happens? Peter and Jesus, you know, the disciples are going around and they're doing these, you know, they're teaching and healing. And remember last week we talked about all these different miracles, about Jesus spitting in the sand, spitting in the guy's face, and healing these different people. And he's talking about open your eyes and see the real point. And then he goes to his disciples and he asks them, hey, who do the people say that I am? And all the different disciples, they say, hey, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're some of the prophets. And then Peter comes up and he says, well, I think you are the Son of God. You are the Christ. And it's not recorded here, but in Matthew, after Peter says this, Jesus kind of says this famous line where he says, Peter, on this rock, your name, which means Peter, I will build a church, right? This has not been revealed to you by man, but it's been revealed to you by God. He gives him this praise. Okay? Immediately following what happens, Jesus, he starts teaching to the disciples and all the people around him, and he says, who you see before you, this person that just been called Christ, the Son of God, is going to suffer, is going to die, is going to be nailed to the cross. And what's crazy here is that Peter takes Jesus and he pulls him aside and he rebukes Jesus. He hornets Jesus. He reprimands Jesus, and he says to Jesus, Jesus, you can't talk like that. That's crazy talk. Because what's Peter thinking? When Peter is thinking about the Son of God, the Messiah, in the Old Testament, is talking about someone who's going to, or at least in the Jewish custom, is talking about someone who's going to liberate them from the Roman rule and the Roman Empire. And so when Jesus is talking about this king, this Messiah that's coming, and he's saying, I'm that person, and all of a sudden now he's saying, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to hang on the cross, I'm going to die. Peter's like, wait, that's not right. That's not the kind of Savior we're talking about. And then Jesus looks at Peter, okay, one of his beloved disciples, and he says, get behind me, Satan. Right? He calls him, well, see, and this is where we have to be careful, though. He's not calling Peter Satan, but Satan, right? He's calling what Peter is trying to say or trying to prevent Jesus from doing satanic, okay? In league of what Satan desires. He doesn't want Jesus to suffer. He doesn't want Jesus to be in this place. And we see it, right? He took him aside, began to rebuke him, and then Peter and Jesus goes and he says, get behind me. Okay? In the other account in Matthew, what Jesus says is in chapter 16, 22 to 23, right? It's the same story, but there's a little bit more detail, because Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. The suffering, the nailing to the cross, the dying for our sake. This is never going to happen to you. And look what he says, what Jesus says in verse 23. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. It's the same thing, but here's where it's important. You are a stumbling block to me. Because Jesus is fully God and yet fully human, what he says to Peter when he says you are a stumbling block, he's saying is, you're tempting me. You're putting these ideas of possibly, maybe I don't have to go through what God's called me to do. Do you see what Jesus is saying here? He said, you're tempting me. Now, if Jesus is only fully God, then this kind of thing cannot come out of what Jesus is saying. We can't see the prayers when Jesus is at Gethsemane before the night that he is crucified, and when he's praying to God and saying, God, please, don't let this happen. Let this cup pass from me. But not my will, but your will. He's showing this anguish. He's showing this desire. And when Jesus is talking to Peter right here, he's saying, look, the things that you're saying, it's tempting. You're stumbling me. Do you see? And so what Jesus is saying is, look, yes, I'm fully God, but I'm also fully human. And so when you're saying these things, my human side kicks in, and it's like, oh, maybe there is a chance I don't have to go through this. Right? And so when Jesus is looking at us and he says, look, later on, when he says the cost of discipleship, he rebukes Peter. He says, don't be a stumbling block. Don't tempt me with these things, because I still have my human, I'm still 100% human. Don't tempt me. And he says, look, this is the cost of discipleship. If you're going to follow me, if you're going to live for me, look what happens. Whoever wants to be my disciple